The frost came early that year, and it came with teeth. Edric Voss stood at the back of the village hall with his arms crossed over his chest, not for warmth, though warmth would have been welcome, but because he did not know what else to do with his hands. The hall was full. Every soul in Dunharrow's Crossing who could still walk had gathered beneath the sagging timber roof, and the air smelled of damp wool and the particular sourness that fear leaves on the skin when it has nowhere else to go. Elder Maren stood at the front, beside the hearth that held more ash than flame. She was 63 years old and had buried 2 husbands, 4 children, and whatever capacity for softness those losses had not already stripped from her. She held a clay pot in both hands. Inside the pot were folded slips of parchment, each one bearing a name. Nobody spoke. They all knew why they were here. The tribute riders had come and gone 3 days ago, their massive wolves leaving tracks in the frozen mud that the children were still too frightened to step across. 40 bushels of grain, 6 iron ingots, 2 healthy cattle. The demand was the same as it had been every autumn for longer than Edric had been alive, scratched in dark ink on hide parchment and sealed with the Gormakthi crest, a split tusk over crossed spears. Every autumn, the village paid. Every autumn, the wolves did not return until the next demand. This autumn, there was nothing to pay with. The grain stores held 11 bushels, maybe 12 if you counted the weevil-rotted sacks that Aldrich the miller had quietly moved to the back of the storehouse and tried not to think about. The cattle were dead. The iron had been traded south for medicine that arrived too late to save the Harwell family's youngest. Dunharrow's Crossing was a village in the specific, terrible process of learning how little it takes to move from poor to doomed. Maren set the pot on the edge of the hearth. "One name," she said. Her voice carried the way dry wood carries flame, quick and without waste. "Whoever is drawn rides to Kethmara Hold with a letter of appeal. They speak for the village. They ask for mercy, or they ask for time, or they ask for whatever the Queen will grant that is not our destruction." A murmur passed through the room like wind through dead grass. "And if the Queen grants nothing?" That was Thomas Fell, the blacksmith, whose forge had been cold for 2 weeks, because there was nothing left to forge. Maren looked at him with the particular steadiness of a woman who has already considered every terrible answer to that question and chosen not to share them. "Then we will know where we stand." She reached into the pot. Edric watched her hand disappear among the folded slips and thought, with the strange clarity that comes in moments of collective dread, that he had never actually finished the map he had been drafting of the Eastern Ridge. Master Corrin would be irritated. Master Corrin was always irritated, but there were degrees, and an unfinished map would place somewhere between a smudge compass rose and a mislabeled river tributary on the old cartographer's personal scale of professional disappointment. Maren unfolded the slip. She read the name once to herself. Something moved across her face that Edric might have called grief if he had been watching more carefully. But he was not watching carefully, because he was thinking about the Eastern Ridge and the way the tree line curved there like the spine of a sleeping animal, and how he had not yet found the right ink to capture it. Edric Voss. The hall turned to look at him. He uncrossed his arms. He opened his mouth. He closed it again. Somewhere in the silence, the fire in the hearth popped once and sent a single ember spiraling upward into the dark. "Oh," Edric said. It was not the response of a hero, but Dunharrow's Crossing was not looking for a hero. They were looking for someone they could spare. The borrowed horse was a sway-backed mare named Thistle, who had opinions about everything and the stamina of a wet rag. Edric had been riding for 6 hours when she simply stopped in the middle of the trail, lowered her head, and began eating frozen grass as though he did not exist. No amount of heel-pressing or rein-tugging or increasingly desperate pleading could convince her that their errand was urgent, that lives depended on forward motion, that the Orc Queen's fortress was not going to come to them. Thistle chewed. Slowly. With what Edric could only describe as philosophical commitment. He dismounted and walked. The road to Kethmara Hold was not truly a road. It was a suggestion, a muddy, half-frozen track that wound through the Greythorn Pass and into the high country where the Gormakthi territories began. The trees changed first. The thin, desperate birches of the Ashvan Valley gave way to massive ironwoods, with bark like cracked armor, their canopies so dense that the weak winter sun vanished entirely. Then the air changed. Colder, yes, but also cleaner, sharper, carrying the mineral bite of stone and snowmelt, and something else, something faintly animal, faintly smoky, that Edric's body recognized as foreign territory before his mind caught up. He was crossing into Orc lands. There were no signs, no fences, no dramatic border markers carved with warnings. But the forest knew, and his bones knew, and Thistle knew, because she stopped eating and began walking again without being asked, her ears flat and her eyes rolling white at the edges. Edric pulled his cloak tighter and tried to remember everything he had ever learned about the Gormakthi. It was not much. His master, old Aldrich Fenn, had kept a single Orc territory map in his collection, hand-copied from a trade delegation survey 40 years prior, almost certainly inaccurate, and annotated in Aldrich's cramped handwriting with notes like "river reportedly moved" and "mountain contested," and in one memorable corner, simply "don't." The cartographer in Edric itched to correct it. Even now, even terrified, some small professional part of his brain was cataloguing the landscape, noting the way the trail switchbacked unnecessarily when a more direct route clearly existed along the ridgeline, observing that the ironwood forest thinned at precisely the elevation where the granite shelf began, filing away the position of a half-frozen waterfall that no human map had ever recorded. He had always done this, mapped things. It was the only skill he possessed that had ever felt like it belonged to him, rather than being borrowed. And even now it steadied his hands and slowed his breathing and kept the panic from swallowing him whole. The panic was considerable. He had the elder's letter tucked inside his coat, pressed against his chest where his heartbeat could keep it warm, as though warmth might somehow make its contents more persuasive. He had read it once before leaving Dunharrow's Crossing, and wished immediately that he hadn't. It was a dignified letter, measured. It outlined the village's hardships, with careful precision, and requested an audience to discuss modified terms. It did not mention that the village was 3 weeks from the starvation. It did not mention the children. It did not mention that Edric had been chosen by lottery because no one with actual negotiating skill had been willing to risk the journey. It was, in short, a letter written by a man who still believed in the power of reasonable language to move unreasonable forces. Edric believed in maps, in the quiet truth of measured distances and recorded terrain, in the way the world made sense when you committed it to parchment with honest lines. He did not know if the Orc Queen would accept honest lines. The fortress appeared at dusk, a dark mass of stone and firelight crowning the ridge above him like a second sunset, brutal and ancient and alive with distant drumming. Thistle stopped again. This time Edric understood completely. He stood in the frozen mud, looking up at Kethmara Hold, and felt every inadequacy he had ever owned settle into his chest, like stones. Then he walked forward anyway. The doors of the tribute hall were taller than any structure in Dunharrow's Crossing. Edric knew this because his mind, desperate for something measurable and safe, tried to calculate their height as the guards pushed them open. 15 feet, perhaps 16. Blackwood banded with iron and old, older than the treaty, older than the tribute system, older than whatever fragile arrangement kept villages like his from being swallowed whole. The hall beyond was vast and warm and alive with firelight. He had expected darkness. He had expected something like a cave, like the stories told to children, the Orc Queen in her mountain lair, gnawing bones by guttering torchlight. But Caithmara's tribute hall was cathedral bright. Braziers lined the walls in iron cradles, their flames painting the black stone in shifting copper and gold. Clan banners hung from the vaulted ceiling, each one enormous, each bearing sigils he did not recognize, but which his cartographer's instinct immediately wanted to catalogue and sketch. The air smelled of wood smoke and something resinous, almost sweet, like juniper burning slow. There were perhaps 40 orcs in the hall, warriors along the walls, advisors clustered near the far end in loose formation around a raised stone platform. Every single one of them turned to watch him enter. Edric's boots were still caked with 3 days of road mud. His cloak was stiff with dried rain. The letter of appeal, clutched in both hands against his chest, had survived the journey only because he had slept curled around it, like a man protecting a child. He walked forward because stopping meant dying, and dying before he delivered the letter meant Dunharrow's Crossing would receive no answer at all. The platform held a single seat, not a throne exactly, but a broad chair carved from the same black stone as the walls, its armrests worn smooth by years of use. And in it sat the Orc Queen. Edric looked up. Later, he would try to describe this moment to himself, and fail. He would attempt to reconstruct it logically, to assign sequence and reason to what happened inside his chest, and he would find nothing that fit. The language he knew, the careful, precise language of borders and coordinates and distances between points, had no vocabulary for this. She was enormous. That was the first thing, the obvious thing, the thing his body registered as danger before his mind caught up. Nearly 7 feet of dense, powerful authority, seated with the coiled stillness of someone who did not need to move to dominate a room. Her skin was deep green, the color of shadow under old-growth canopy, and it caught the firelight along the planes of her face and the hard architecture of her jaw. Her black hair was pulled back in warrior braids threaded with iron rings that clinked faintly, the only sound in the hall. Her tusk curved upward from her lower jaw, carved with fine marks he could not read from this distance, but which his fingers inexplicably wanted to trace. And her eyes. Her eyes were amber, not the flat pale amber of cheap resin, but the deep, layered amber of something ancient, caught mid-glow. Honey and fire, and the last light of autumn compressed into something startlingly, almost painfully warm. She looked at him. He stopped walking. Not because he chose to, not because his courage failed, though it had never been particularly robust to begin with. He stopped because something in his chest seized with a sensation he had no name for, and his legs simply refused to carry him forward, while his mind was occupied with the single, devastating, completely unhelpful thought that she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. The hall was silent. Varith Gorshai tilted her head 1 degree. The iron rings in her braids shifted and caught the light. Edric realized his mouth was open. He closed it, opened it again. No sound emerged. Somewhere behind the queen, an advisor leaned toward another and murmured something in Orcish. Edric stood in the firelight of Caithmara Hold, holding a crumpled letter he had forgotten existed, and understood with perfect, terrible clarity that he was not afraid. He was something far more dangerous. The hall swallowed sound the way deep water swallows stones. Edric heard his own breathing first, then the low murmur of voices in a language he did not speak, then the crack and hiss of torches set high in iron brackets along walls of black stone that rose and rose until the firelight gave up trying to find the ceiling. He had been walking for what felt like a very long time. 2 guards flanked him, their footsteps measured and unhurried, and he matched their pace because his legs had stopped consulting him about decisions some while back. The letter was in his hands. He could feel the wax seal under his thumb, already soft from the heat of his grip, and he pressed into it like a man pressing a wound. The tribute hall opened before him the way a jaw opens, Clan banners hung from the unseen heights, each one broader than the front of his cottage, dyed in colours so deep they seemed to pull light into themselves. He recognized none of the sigils. Along the walls, figures stood or sat in clusters, advisors, warriors, officials of rank he could not pass, and every single one of them turned to look at him as he entered. He was aware, with the detached clarity of a man watching his own funeral, that he was still wearing mud to his knees, that his cloak was torn at the hem where the horse had stepped on it during the river crossing, that his hair was plastered to his forehead, and his nose was running slightly from the cold, and he looked, by any honest measure, like something a river had rejected. The guard stopped, he stopped, and then he looked up. She was seated at the far end of the hall on a chair carved from dark stone, though seated was perhaps the wrong word for what she was doing to that chair. She occupied it the way weather occupies a landscape, completely inevitably, with the quiet implication that everything else had arranged itself around her and not the other way around. Her armor was dark iron and leather, worked with patterns he could not read. Her black hair was pulled back in warrior braids threaded with iron rings that caught the torchlight in small, hard sparks. Her tusks were carved. He could see the marks from here, fine and deliberate, though he did not know what they meant. Her skin was the green of deep shade, of moss on old stone, of the color the forest becomes when the canopy is so thick that sunlight has to negotiate its way through. She was looking at him. He was supposed to speak. He understood this. The letter was in his hands, and the words were in the letter, and the entire desperate machinery of Dunharrow's Crossing had been pointed at this single moment, this one attempt to explain that they could not pay, that the harvest had failed, that the cattle were dead, that they were asking, begging, for mercy or time or anything at all. He opened his mouth. Her eyes were amber, not brown, not gold, not any of the words he would have reached for first. Amber, the precise color of tree resin held up to firelight, layered and warm and so deeply, startlingly alive that he felt something in his chest rearrange itself without permission. He closed his mouth. The hall was very quiet. One of the advisors near the Queen's chair shifted, and someone said something low in Orcish that might have been a question, or might have been a command, and Edric heard none of it, because he was still standing in the wreckage of whatever had just happened inside his own ribcage. The Orc Queen regarded him. Her expression did not change, but something moved behind those amber eyes, a flicker, a question, and for one fraction of one moment, Vareth Gorshai looked at this mud-covered, trembling, spectacularly unqualified human man and saw something she did not expect. He was not afraid of her. He was looking at her. The letter hung forgotten in his hands, its seal cracked, its purpose suddenly and entirely beside the point. Edric had always understood the world through lines, contour and elevation, the careful hatching that told a traveller where solid ground gave way to marsh, the precise angle of a river's bend rendered in ink so that someone who had never stood on its bank could still find their way home. He had spent 6 years learning to translate the physical world into something flat and legible, something a person could fold and carry in their pocket and trust with their life. None of that helped him now. He sat on the edge of the low stone bed in the chamber they had given him, a room clearly designed for someone twice his size, the ceiling vaulted high enough that his voice would have echoed if he had possessed the courage to speak above a whisper. The firs beneath him smelled of cedar smoke, and something earthen he couldn't name. A clay basin of water sat on a broad table near the door, still warm, and beside it someone had placed a round of dark bread and a bowl of stew thick with root vegetables and shredded meat. He had not touched either. His hands would not stop shaking. Not from cold. Not any more. The hole was warmer than any building in Dunharrow's Crossing, heated by deep vents that carried warmth up from somewhere far below the stone. His fingers trembled for a different reason entirely, and he kept pressing them flat against his thighs as though he could physically hold them still. He was trying to think. The Queen had not killed him. She had not laughed at the letter. She had not ordered the village burned or its people scattered into the winter hills. She had read the elder's words with an expression he could not decipher, and then she had looked at him with those amber eyes that held more light than the torches around them, and she had said something in Makdari to the advisor at her left. The advisor had frowned. Vareth had repeated herself quieter, in a tone that did not invite repetition of the frown. Then she had told Edric, in his own language, that he would stay the night, that they would speak again in the morning, that he should eat. He pressed his hands harder against his legs and stared at the far wall, where a woven hanging depicted a mountain range he did not recognize. The peaks were rendered in deep indigo thread against a field of black, and the rivers that cut between them were stitched in silver that caught the firelight from the brazier near the door. A cartographer's instinct surfaced despite everything. He traced the rivers with his eyes, followed their confluences, tried to identify the range from memory. The Thornspine. No, the peaks were wrong. Something farther north, maybe. Something beyond the borders of any map he had ever copied. Territory he did not know. He exhaled slowly and let his gaze drop to his own hands. They were still trembling, ink-stained at the fingertips, calloused along the right middle finger where his pen rested during long hours of drafting. Ordinary hands. Hands built for careful, small, quiet work. He thought about the way Vareth's hands had looked holding the elder's letter. The sheer scale of her fingers against that fragile rectangle of parchment. How carefully she had held it. How she had not torn it, though she could have reduced it to dust without effort. How she had turned it over and read both sides, including the part the elder had written in smaller script at the bottom. The part Edric had not been shown. He wondered what it said. He wondered what she had seen in his face during that long, terrible, luminous silence in the tribute hall, when every thought in his head had emptied out and left nothing but the raw, unguarded truth of his own expression. He wondered if she knew that he had no idea what that truth was. The bread sat cooling. The stew thickened in its bowl. Edric Voss, who had spent his whole life making sense of unfamiliar terrain, sat in the dark heart of an orc fortress and understood for the first time what it meant to be somewhere no map could help him. Edric had known fear his whole life. He had simply never understood it until now. Fear was the lottery drum turning in Elder Marin's hands. Fear was the borrowed horse stumbling on black ice 3 miles from Kethmara Hold. Fear was the tribute hall opening before him like the throat of something vast and hungry, and every armored figure within it, turning to measure the weight of his bones. He had catalogued these fears with the quiet precision of a man accustomed to recording distances between landmarks. Each one discrete, each one survivable, each one, in retrospect, remarkably small. What he felt now was not fear. He sat on the edge of the cot in the chamber they had given him, a room carved from the same black stone as everything else in the hold, but fitted with unexpected comforts. A wool blanket that smelled of cedar smoke, a basin of water that was still faintly warm, a candle that someone had thought to light before he arrived. His hands rested on his knees. They were not shaking. That was the part he could not reconcile. In the tribute hall, standing before the most powerful figure in the Gormakthi territories, his hands had been perfectly steady. His voice had been the one to break. He kept returning to the moment, the precise, irreversible second when he had looked up from his crumpled letter and seen her face in the torchlight, and every prepared word had simply evacuated his mind like birds startled from a field. He had opened his mouth to deliver the elder's appeal, and what had come out was nothing. A breath. A sound so small it could not have carried past the first row of advisors. But she had heard it. He was certain of that. Vareth Gorshai, seated above him with the weight of 17 carved victory marks on her tusks and the authority of 11 years in her bearing, had heard that tiny failed breath and had, for just a fraction of a second, tilted her head, the way a person tilts toward an unfamiliar sound. Not threat assessment, not the calculation of a ruler measuring a supplicant's worth. Curiosity. He pressed his palms flat against his knees and stared at the candle flame and tried to be honest with himself, because honesty was the only tool he had ever been any good with. He had not frozen from terror. The advisors believed he had. The guards certainly believed it. He suspected even the sharp-eyed woman with the ledger, the one who had watched him like a hawk tracking a mouse across open ground, believed that the trembling human had simply locked up in the presence of the Queen, the way so many others must have before him. Let them believe it. The truth was worse. The truth was that Edric Voss, a man who had spent 28 years perfecting the art of being unremarkable, had looked at the Orc Queen and felt something crack open behind his ribs with the force of a door blown inward by a storm. Not fear, not awe, though there was awe in it, threaded through like copper wire through dark stone. Something older than either, something he had no map for. She was the most extraordinary thing he had ever seen. He understood how dangerous that thought was. He understood that he was a tribute envoy from a starving village, sitting in the seat of a power that could erase Dunharrow's Crossing from memory, and that the feeling expanding through his chest like warm light had no place here. No strategic value, no survival function whatsoever. He also understood that he could not unfeel it. Down the corridor, muffled by stone and distance, he heard the low resonance of voices in council. They were deciding what to do with him. With Dunharrow's Crossing. With the failed tribute and the question of what leniency cost a queen who could not afford to appear lenient. Edric stood. He crossed to the basin and washed his face with water that had gone cold. Tomorrow he would need words. Tomorrow he would need to be the negotiator he had never been, for the sake of people who were counting on him to be more than he was. Tonight, he pressed his wet hands to his eyes and breathed, and did not call it fear. The iron rings in Vareth's hair clinked softly as she turned her head, watching the first grey light of morning creep across the stone floor of her private council chamber. She had not slept. This was not unusual. What was unusual was the reason. She kept seeing his hands, not clenched, not raised in defense or supplication, just open, resting on the table between them during those hours of negotiation that had somehow become something else entirely. Open hands, unguarded hands, the hands of a man who drew maps for a living and had apparently never learned the instinct to make fists. She pressed her thumb against the carved tusk at the corner of her mouth, the 7th victory mark earned when she was 26, and had brokered the mountain pass accord with the Skelvari clan through 3 days of negotiation that nearly became a war. She had been proud of that mark once. Now she found herself wondering what Edric Voss would think of it, and the wondering made her chest tight in a way she did not care for. A knock at the chamber door. She straightened. Enter. Goreth stepped inside, her oldest advisor, his grey-green skin weathered to the texture of bark. He carried 2 clay cups of broth and set one before her without asking whether she wanted it. The human is awake, he said, pacing his quarters. He asked the guard for parchment and ink an hour ago. Anne? We gave it to him. Goreth settled into the chair across from her with the careful economy of old joints. He's been drawing since. The guard says it looks like a map of the eastern corridor. From memory. Vareth wrapped both hands around the warm cup and said nothing. Goreth watched her. He had watched her for 11 years, and before that had watched her father for 20. Very little escaped him, which was precisely why she kept him close, and precisely why he was occasionally unbearable. You could send him home today, he said. The terms are drafted, the seasonal adjustment, the cartography exchange, the reduced tribute schedule. It is more than fair. It is, if I am being honest, more generous than anything you have offered a human settlement in the entirety of your reign. The terms are strategically sound. They are. Dunharrow's Crossing controls the only reliable ford across the Ashfen. A stable relationship benefits us. It does. This is governance, Goreth, not sentiment. He sipped his broth. The silence that followed was the particular silence of someone who had decided not to argue because the argument was already won. Vareth set her cup down harder than necessary. Say what you came to say. He looks at you, Goreth said simply. Not at the tusks, not at the throne. At you. I have served 2 rulers of the Gormakthi, and I have never seen a human look at either of them the way that boy looked at you in the tribute hall. He paused. I have never seen anyone look at you that way. The rings in her hair clinked again as she turned sharply toward the window. Outside, the hold was waking. She could hear the smiths beginning their morning work, the low calls of the perimeter watch-changing shifts, the familiar machinery of the world she had built through will and iron and the absolute refusal to be soft. Her reflection ghosted in the thick glass. Green skin, strong jaw. Amber eyes that she had been told, once, by her mother, were beautiful. She had been 14. Her mother had died the following winter. No one had said it since, until a mud-splattered cartographer's apprentice had stood in her hall and forgotten how to breathe. She reached up and touched one of the iron rings braided into her hair. Each one represented a bond, to clan, to duty, to the throne. She had never considered that there might be room for one more. Send for him, she said quietly. Tell him to bring his maps. Goreth rose, and if he smiled as he turned toward the door, he had the decency to hide it. The ink was mixed from ironwood ash and river water, the same formula the Gormakthi had used for binding agreements since before Edric's grandfather's grandfather had drawn his first breath. Vareth prepared it herself, which her advisers clearly found unusual, grinding the ash with a stone pestle at the long table that had been cleared of maps and weapons and the remnants of the previous night's council debate. Edric watched her hands. He had been watching her hands for 3 days now, ever since the first morning she had allowed him to sit across from her in the strategy chamber and explain, in halting but increasingly steady detail, what Dunharrow's Crossing could actually offer. Not grain, not cattle, not iron, maps. The idea had come to him somewhere between his 3rd cup of that brutally strong Gormakthi tea and the moment Vareth had unrolled a territorial chart, so outdated it still showed the River Kess, running 40 leagues east of its current course. He had corrected her without thinking, finger-tracing the actual waterway from memory, and she had gone quiet in that particular way of hers that he was learning meant she was not angry, but rather deeply intensely recalculating. A cartographer's apprentice, the most useless thing a desperate village could send to an orc queen. Unless the queen's maps were wrong, unless every territorial dispute with the northern clans, every contested hunting ground, every seasonal migration route her people depended on was being negotiated from charts that hadn't been redrawn in 40 years. Unless accurate knowledge of the land was worth more than 40 bushels of grain could ever be. Vareth set down the pestle. The ink was ready, black and faintly gleaming in its shallow stone bowl. She slid it to the center of the table, then placed 2 writing instruments beside it. One was Gormakthi, a sharpened bone stylus with a carved grip designed for hands much larger than his. The other was a human quill, goosefeather, slightly battered. She had sent someone to find it. He did not know where or how, and he understood that asking would diminish the gesture. The treaty itself was simple. Dunharrow's Crossing would provide updated cartographic surveys of the Ashfen Valley and its surrounding territories each season. Detailed, accurate, drawn to Edric's standard. In exchange, the village's material tribute would be suspended for 2 years, then renegotiated based on what the maps revealed about shared resources. It was, by any reasonable measure, a practical arrangement, mutually beneficial, strategically sound. It was also the first treaty in Gormakthi history, authored in part by a human hand, and every advisor in Kethmara Hold knew it. Vareth signed first. The bone stylus looked natural in her grip, her strokes confident, the sharp angles of her written name carrying the same authority as her voice. She set the stylus down and looked at him. Edric picked up the quill. His hand was not shaking, which surprised him less than it would have a week ago. He wrote his name beneath hers, the letters smaller, rounder, a different language's architecture entirely. The two signatures sat together on the page like two species of tree growing from the same soil, different in every visible way and drawing from identical ground. He set the quill down. The silence in the chamber was not empty. It was the silence of witnesses understanding that something had shifted. A border redrawn not on any map, but in the space between what these two peoples had been to each other and what they might, with sufficient patience and terrifying hope, become. Vareth's amber eyes held his. There was no softness in her expression. There never was, not in public, not with her counsel present, and the weight of 11 years of iron authority resting on her shoulders. But her hand, resting on the table beside the drying treaty, turned slowly upward, open, palm to the torchlight. He understood. Edric placed his hand in hers and her fingers closed around it, warm and steady and careful in a way that had nothing to do with gentleness and everything to do with choice. Outside Kethmara Hold, the first snow of the season began to fall.